So last month, I had the awesome opportunity to speak at the Magical Education Council's ConVocation event. And at that event, I taught a class called The Magical Afterlives of Witches, which the title there is sort of a play off of the idea that uh, we assign kind of an identity posthumously to figures in history. And with witches, there's been a lot of identities assigned to them, frequently based on the idea that they weren't actually witches and that we need to look at them in some other context. And the premise of my class was that sometimes we should just look at them as witches and learn about them in a magical sense. And so the class dealt with that, going through the history, how we engage with history, how we learn from history, how we can learn about these people, and how we can learn magical elements from looking at what was said and written about those people. And so it covered a lot of the intellectual elements, but it didn't really cover the nuts and bolts. How do you do ancestor work, or how do you do magic with these people? And so I felt that that was a really important part to cover, and decided I would do a follow up that would just be online for free, even though I probably should be recording some more classes that are paid classes. I'm going to do this one first and get another free one out there for the community. Um, but I wanted to cover some of those more detailed practical elements as a follow up to that class, because that really was supposed to be part of what I wanted to cover in the class, but there was so much, because the history is so interesting and so deep, that we didn't really have time to get into more than analyzing accounts of spells and rituals and things and comparing those to things that we might do today. So this is going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we talked about previously, but it's mostly going to be how to practically engage with these spirits, how to incorporate these spirits into a system of ancestor work. And when we talk about them in the context of ancestor work, then we might think of them as ancestors of affinity. These are not necessarily ancestors who are blood ancestors, but they're ancestors that we have some sort of connection with because we have something shared with them. There's an affinity that we have. And I think that touches on the struggle that some people have with who is an ancestor. A lot of times we assume an ancestor has to be a blood relative, but that's not really how most cultures think of ancestors. There's also a lot of debate about good ancestors or bad ancestors, or how do we connect with ancestors if we don't know about our family history, or for people who were adopted or grew up in foster care and don't have connections with their blood family, how, or maybe don't even know who their blood family is, how do they connect with their ancestors? And what I think is really special about dealing with ancestors in this context, where we're dealing with ancestors of affinity, is it takes away some of those questions, because we don't have to worry about blood relationships. We don't have to worry about family. We don't have to worry about whether or not you know your family. Everyone can be included in this, because we're already stepping outside of that box of family and blood relations. Now, as far as good versus bad, that might still be a question that people have, because some of these figures, we know them because they were described in criminal trials. And I think a lot of people assume that witch trials are just, oh, a person did something weird, or a person was a little outspoken, and so the easiest way to shut them up was to call them a witch and to try them as a witch. And that's not actually the case in most trials, in most places. There are a lot of times where people are brought in because they were known to practice some sort of magic, and magistrates were just like, well, they're just doing some folk magic. Who cares about that? And they let the people go. Sometimes those people got punishments that were not execution. It really depended on the time and the place. And you have other times where people went crazy and are just trying everyone for everything, because they're just lifting off random people, and because you got accused, you were in very high danger at that point. But that's not what was happening all the time or everywhere. That was kind of in explosive moments where there was kind of a powder keg of activity happening. In a lot of places and a lot of times, witch trials were associated with uses of magic to harm people, or uses of magic for sedition, or for treason, or for offenses that would have been relatively serious criminal offenses even if magic wasn't used. And so some of the people that we might look at as historical witches are people who, whether they actually did the magic for these things or not, they may be people who would not have been pleasant in their community, or people who had a reputation for having conflicts in the community. And so they might be those sort of people that you would look at outside of a context of witches if they were just your blood ancestors and be like, well, that person was kind of nasty, and I don't know if they're the person I want to work with. So that question might still be a question people might ask and explore. You might also look at some of those accounts and say, well, was this person really that bad, or is this just the context of the trial that they're being presented in? Personally, my take on that good ancestor versus bad ancestor thing is that death is a process of healing. When we die, our bodies weaken and our bodies become infirm. Our bodies lose their health. But that strength, that vitality, that health is transferring to our spiritual being. And our spiritual being is being healed and cleansed and reset in that dying process. And so part of that healing and part of that strengthening and development that happens is that it cuts away a lot of the baggage that was accreted in life. And so if there are things where a person struggled and had a hard life, and so they were a difficult or unpleasant person, or they had some points of view and perspectives that they picked up because of the time that they grew up in, or because of some bad experiences they had, then those are the things that they might heal from through the process of death. And so they might not be as attached to those bad ideas or those bad behaviors once they die. Now, if someone just at their core was problematic and did bad things because at their core that's who they were, that might not be something that's healed through death, because that might just be who they are. And so those might be people that you want to work with less. You kind of have to take it on a case by case. And even if someone is healed through death and is better in the afterlife than they were in life, if they were somebody who you knew personally and were impacted by, or if you knew someone who was seriously hurt or traumatized by them, but you yourself were not, but indirectly experienced this, then that might still be too much for you to deal with. And you don't necessarily have to try to deal with that. You shouldn't put yourself in a position where you are being harmed by attempting to connect with particular ancestors or spirits. Now, in the cases of these long dead witches, they won't have caused trauma in your life or in the lives of people that you were close to. So even if we're looking at Chaddocks and Demdike, who were kind of known to be difficult people to deal with in their communities and difficult with each other in particular, then the fact that they were potentially difficult people, and maybe that's part of the core of who they were, or maybe that's something that they've healed from in death, you haven't been harmed by that, and so you can probably connect with them and still feel okay doing so. And if the connection with them proves not fruitful, you don't have to continue. You can kind of check spirits out, see what works, see who you connect with, see who you don't connect with, keep working with the ones you connect with, and move on from the ones you don't connect with, just like with any other spirits. When we work with ancestors, sometimes we're going to work with them by name. We will know often who our parents were, who our grandparents were, who aunts and uncles and great aunts and uncles were, cousins, family, friends. Those are the sorts of people where we will call them by name when we are calling on our ancestors. But we'll also have older ancestors that we don't know by name. We might even have ancestors that aren't particularly older. They were just disconnected from the parts of the family that we knew, and so we don't know them enough to call them by name. And so often we will honor ancestors collectively, honor unnamed ancestors. And we can do the same when we're dealing with ancestors of affinity. When we work with our witch ancestors, then we can call upon certain ones that we work with regularly by name. We can call upon certain ones that we have built connections and alliances with by name. But we can also honor the collective of witch ancestors and the collective of witches who came before us without necessarily having to name them all. And that's something where you could incorporate that into your practice without going through the rest of the details of what we're going to talk about. If you want just kind of to have that connection in a general sense, have some of that witch energy and witch inheritance coming through into an existing ancestor practice, then lighting a candle for the witch ancestors and calling upon them as a collective is a possibility without having to go through connecting with individual ones or building a whole special connection on top of the rest of your ancestor work. But if you want to deal with some more individual ones and deal on a more individual basis, we're going to talk about some of those options as well. Now, in terms of this idea of ancestors of affinity, some people might still be thinking, well, no, but your ancestors are your blood relatives. They're people that they're in your blood, that their blood has passed down through to you. But really, if we think about it historically, there's lots of points in any family where there will be people who were brought into a family who were not blood relatives, and there will be people who believed someone was a blood relative, but they really weren't. There's not always that surety there, and so even if you're working with your ancestors by blood, there's probably people in your bloodline, and maybe even people that you're recognizing by name, who you might not actually be blood related to. And the connections that are there because of how they contributed to your family and the line that eventually culminated in you, those connections don't change, whether everyone along that line is truly a blood relative or not, and whether you are certain of whether or not everyone along that line is a blood relative or not. So, thinking about it from that perspective, we can already just say, okay, an attachment that it must be blood relatives doesn't necessarily hold up, doesn't necessarily make sense. But we can also look at traditions of ancestor work. In a lot of cultures, you have your ancestors of your family, but you also have the ancestors of the community as a whole. And now there's a sense in a lot of traditional cultures that the community overall is related in some way, that the whole community comes from an original person or original group of people, and those people had a connection, and so everyone in the community is descended from those people, and the community is kind of a broader family overall. And often in traditional religions, there is a mirroring of that, where household religion and the public religion look similar in a lot of ways. The household religion is just dealing with smaller versions of what the community religion is dealing with. So you have the the hearth fire for the community and the hearth fire for the home. You have the ancestors for the community, the ancestors for the home, the gods of the community, and the gods and spirits of the home. But in that model, we're already acknowledging that there are ancestors that are beyond your scope of individual family ancestors, the ancestors that your family honors specifically as their family line. There are also those ancestors or the great ones of the community who are ancestors of the community as a whole that are also honored. And so that idea that it is just your specific bloodline, that's not something that plays out in traditional cultures. Traditional cultures have a much broader idea of how people are connected. We also have lots of ways of relating to people aside from just blood. We can relate to people who laid groundwork for us, people who came before us in the field that we work in areas that we're interested in the areas that are our hobbies and our modes of recreation, anything that's important to us, where there are people who were important in developing that thing that we have now, we share a link with them. When we engage in that activity, we're engaging in an activity that they engaged in also. We're connected to them through that activity, through that work, through that shared interest, and through what we receive from them. We are still receiving things and inheriting things from them and from their work that help build us. People who taught us, people who aided us, these are people who can be like family, who may have been in our lives that we actually knew, but were not blood relations, but they were still people who were part of that village that brought us up, that collective group of people who shaped who we are. And so there are connections that we have with them. There are things that we have inherited from them, that we have taken from them. And so there is that relationship, that inheritance, that progression from one person to another, going back through a line of people, where without just having a blood connection, we can have a spiritual connection with those people. Then there are also people who are simply like us. So, not necessarily people that we knew who taught us or helped us, or people who necessarily did important things that contributed to what we do now, but just people where we share characteristics, we share activities, we share things that make us the same as them. And like this is something that we see in the LGBTQIA community, where they talk about people who came before, that not just people who did major thing in establishing rights or establishing the community, but just looking at people through history who were examples of queer relationships and queer individuals, in times where it was less common, times where there was less support, times where it was less protected. We have that also as witches. As witches, we can look back and say, okay, there were these other people who were like us. They were different from the rest of society in the same ways that we're different. They connected with powers that other people don't connect with in the same ways that we do. They connected with spirits that other people don't connect with in the same ways that we do. And not only can we learn from them, but we can recognize ourselves in them. We can recognize that we are a reflection of what they once were, what was once in the world through them. And so there is that connection there that we can reach back to and build a link from that. Now, if there wasn't a connection, we are magicians, we're magical people. We could forge a link, we could create a link magically. And when we're talking about witches, that would be even easier to do because they are already people who are liminal, who were straddling the threshold of the spirit world while they were alive, and so they still straddle that threshold in death. And so they're people that would be easier to reach back to and call out to and create a link to, because they were people who were already doing that across the boundaries of life and death in their own lives. But we do have a link, we have a connection already in place through that similarity, through that affinity, through shared practices. Now, once we recognize that we want to incorporate witch ancestors into our practice, we have to figure out who our witch ancestors were. Now, for some people, they might want to look back at their own family lines and try to find witches in their family lines, and that can be interesting and it can be rewarding. It can also be a thing that people get a little overly excited about sometimes. Particularly for Americans, you see a lot of people who point to having Salem ancestry. Uh, Personally, I am not aware of any Salem witches in my ancestry, but I do have ancestors connected to Connecticut witch trials, and ancestors who were pretty early colonists. But I don't think I have any Salem witch trial people. The thing with the Salem witch trials is that's one of the witch trials that we can look at and say, well, yeah, no, this was a hysteria moment. Almost no one involved in these trials shows any real signs of having an actual connection to a magical practice. It's very unlikely that any of these people actually practice magic or are actually witches. A lot of the social elements behind witch trials play out in Salem, and so a lot of those social elements have been kind of assumed to play out in all witch trials, but they don't. But Salem, we can look at a lot of social impetuses and say, okay, this is why these trials happened. This is why these people were accused, and just tons of people were being accused, and it didn't really matter whether anyone had any actual reason for being accused. Whereas there's a lot of other witch trials where we can look at it and say, like, okay, well, this person had a reputation for magic aside from just their trial account. There's things that they're admitting where these are things that are describing actual magical practices, but other people are also showing up as witnesses describing actual magical practices that this person did. And it's not just parroting the assumptions of the inquisitors. It's not just people accusing random people. We can look at this person's life and say, okay, this person was doing magic. Whether they did the things that the trial is saying or not is another question. But you'll see a lot of people who they're like, oh, I'm descended from this person from Salem, or this witch from Salem, and that's pretty cool from an historical basis. But that person's probably not really a witch ancestor because they probably weren't really a witch. And so it's not necessarily establishing a connection to witchcraft. Uh, you don't need to find people who are your actual blood ancestors. Again, that's the whole thing we've talked about. These are ancestors of affinity. So it can be kind of cool if you do find people who are blood ancestors. But again, you want to look at the actual nature of the accounts surrounding them. Is there reason to believe that this person was actually involved in witchcraft or actually involved in magic? Or were they just somebody who was a victim? And if they were just somebody who's a victim, do you still want to look at them as somebody that you're contacting as a witch spirit? I think you'll probably get more mileage out of contacting people who there's reasons to believe that they actually had associations with magic and witchcraft. Now, identifying these historical figures and looking at determining which ones likely did magic and which ones likely were witches, that's something that we talked about a lot in part one. So we're not going to get super in depth into how to do that or super in depth into how to engage history here in part two. If you haven't listened to part one, I recommend going back and listening to that because there's a lot of great material there. Now, places that we can look for these witch ancestors, we can look at folk stories and mythology. And for mythology, it's pretty obvious. We've got figures like Medea, Pasiphae, Erecto, Cerce, tons of witches in Greek and Roman mythology. We have witches across the world in mythologies that we can look at. And those figures can be really interesting and really inspiring. Sometimes stories will describe magic that they do, but frequently it'll just be they mixed a potion and fed someone a potion, or they tapped someone with their wand, or they looked at someone and this happened to them. And so there won't be a lot that we can learn from those figures in terms of actual ritual or spells by looking at the stories about them. But they are figures that we can connect with magically, that we can call upon. And some of these mythological figures, they might even be figures that we may be able to look at beyond just looking at ancestral figures, because in a lot of these stories, these figures are going to be kind of quasi-divine figures. And so we may be able to call upon them in a way more similar to how we might call upon an elevated spirit or a spirit that's more similar to a god. There's also going to be a lot of figures that we see in folk stories. And so people might kind of question, like, okay, well, between the folk stories and the actual history, where's the difference? Where's the dividing line there? And I would say if you look at most areas, you're going to have kind of folk tales about a witch for that area. And it might not be like every town or every county, but in a broad area, you will see that there's often going to be some sort of witch legend. In my own area, we have Muldier, and this is a good example of one where it kind of skirts the line between folk story and history. Uh, Muldier's story is very historical, but there's not records or evidence that supports it, and so it's a legend. It's a folk story, and there are things that are pointed to as the actual places she was connected with, but there's not a lot of proof supporting that. Then you have other folk witches where they might have an actual person that they're linked to, where there are some trial records, but it's not certain that the folk legend and this actual historical person are the same person. You might have some where the folk legend is completely distinct from any known historical person, and there's nothing to support historical evidence, but they seem like a generally real person. And then you have others where the person in the folk story seems much more like a spirit or a boogeyman. And so you have a pretty wide array of types of figures that you might find in folklore and folk legends and folk stories. You'll also have some areas where there's a lot of folk stories about witches and what witches did and people's interactions with witches, where the witch isn't necessarily named, where you just have uh, kind of a story described of like this a farmer dealt with this and there was a witch and they dealt with the witch this way, or the witch did this or that. And so you might have like a witch of a place, or a witch of a story, where you don't have a name for them outside of the story or outside of the place that they're associated with, but there's still things that you can learn about witches from that story, or things that you might connect with or feel drawn to in the way the characters described in the story. And looking at a lot of your kind of 19th century folklore collections, you'll see a lot of the stories where you can see these witch figures who aren't necessarily named individuals, but they describe kind of the beliefs about witchcraft in the area and personify those beliefs into a person in the story. And so I think it's just as reasonable to connect with those, I don't want to say archetypes, but maybe icons of the local witch, as it is to connect with actual individual people that we can identify as witches. History wise, again, that's what we kind of went through in class one, where we're looking at trial documents and data. We're looking at historical news accounts, historical figures, and some of them might not be in trial. Some of them might be just recognized from folk history about the person or ballads about the person. Um, Mother Shipton stands out as an example, or Thomas the Rhymer stands out as an example, where we're not looking at people who we remember through trials, but people who were still known by their community and where stories about them in their community still survive. There might also be family legends, in addition to your local legends. There might be stories in your family about a particular person in the family, or a particular person who the family had an encounter with. And so those stories can inform us as well. In my family, my great grandmother, my maternal great grandmother, I've heard stories about her but haven't met her, and I don't know how true the stories are, but as far as I've been told, she had a reputation for being a witch. So at this point, I'm fairly certain she is deceased, but I don't actually know. And so she would be somebody who, if she is, I could call upon as a witch ancestor, based on those stories that I know about her, uh, not necessarily based on any actual experience of her that way. So those are the sorts of people you might look for in your family. Like, is there somebody who there was an ancestor who was reputed to be a witch, or an ancestor who was reputed to do magic, or where there were strange things about that ancestor. And when you start putting together the stories of the strange things, they start matching a familiar pattern where you're looking at it and you're like, well, you were just describing a witch. They just didn't call it that. Or maybe there's somebody who impacted your family where they were not a family member, but maybe there's a story of a grandparent or a great grandparent who ran into a witch in their community, and that interaction somehow impacted your family, either in some positive or negative way. And if it was a negative way, maybe they're not somebody who you're going to incorporate as an ancestor, but if it was a positive way, I think it would be completely reasonable. And if it was a negative way, it might be something where you do some work with that person to resolve whatever the issues were that caused that negative impact, and then work with that person as a witch ancestor. Now, in terms of that kind of question of like whether or not you may have to resolve some issues or how you go about contacting that person, brings us to our next topic, which is how do we make connections with these witch ancestors. Now, again, if we're dealing with them in a collective sense, we don't have to do a lot. If we have an existing ancestor practice, then we just add a candle for unnamed witches that we want to call upon, and we honor witch ancestors collectively, and whichever ones want to respond and be part of that might choose to respond and be part of that. We don't have to do a lot of heavy lifting there, but it's going to give us a rather kind of vague and background connection. They're just going to be part of our overall collective of ancestors at that point, and we don't know who it is that's bringing something to the table there. So that kind of energy, that inheritance of that witch presence will be there. It just might not be there in the particular ways we want or as strong as we want. Now, if we want to get a little bit more in depth where we're working with specific individuals, we can integrate that into a current ancestor practice still. We don't have to only integrate an unknown collective if we're working with our current ancestor practice. And I would assume in most ancestor practices, people have a handful of named ancestors that they connect with, and then they're kind of unnamed collective of the rest of their ancestors. And so what we'd be looking at here is just kind of adding some witches to those named ancestors that we're working with, and working with them alongside the rest of our ancestors. And the nice part about this is if you have an ongoing ancestor practice, this is easy. This is the easy way to do it, because, as we've talked about in a lot of places, your ancestors can be intermediaries with the spirit world. They can go through and they can negotiate things in the spirit world for you, in ways that might be a little bit easier than you doing it, because they're already there, and they can go connect with those spirits directly. So, if you want to integrate a witch amongst your ancestors, figure out what witch it is. So, let's say Bessie Dunlop is who you want to connect with, and you want to start working Bessie Dunlop into your ancestor work. You could start off by calling on your ancestors in whatever sort of ancestor service you normally do, make offerings to them, and then ask them to reach out to Bessie and to connect with her for you. Ask them to go to her and see if she is willing to be welcome amongst your ancestors and connect with you as a witch ancestor or as a magical ancestor. And then you would finish the rest of that ancestor service and the rest of that interaction however you normally do. Give your ancestors time to go and accomplish this for you. You don't just assume that you ask them in that interaction, and so you immediately, in that same interaction, start treating Bessie as if she's there. Maybe in your next interaction with your ancestors, you would go ahead and invite and welcome Bessie amongst your ancestors. And so you go through your regular ancestor service, call upon your ancestors, and then call upon Bessie Dunlop, ask her if she's willing to be welcome amongst your ancestors, and ask your ancestors to welcome them amongst themselves, welcome her amongst themselves. And then you would make offerings to your ancestors and offerings to Bessie. And then from that point, I would say maybe do some divination to confirm it, make sure that she's actually on board with it. Or if you communicate well with the dead, you can go based on your own psychic impressions. But the divination is a good way to give yourself a concrete determination on that, as opposed to just assuming. Finish up that interaction, and then over time, if she said yes, she's willing to be part of your group of ancestors, then when you do your ancestor service, just continue calling her as one of your named ancestors, just like you would call the rest of them, and include her with the rest of your ancestors as if she is just the same as the rest of your ancestors. Once that relationship develops and you have that connection, and she has that connection with you from her calling to her repeatedly, from her sharing space, sharing energy with your ancestors, receiving offerings with your ancestors, then you've built that connection where she is now one of your ancestors. And so, like any of your other ancestors, you can begin to work with her individually just as you can collectively. And so, whatever your preferred method for working with an individual ancestor is, whether it's doing your ancestor service but only calling that ancestor, or if it's setting up a meal and lighting a candle and calling an individual ancestor, or some other ritual for calling upon an individual spirit of the dead, then you would do that and call upon Bessie just like you would one of your other ancestors. And then you can work with her individually at that point. And we'll talk a little bit more about what you would do working individually with a witch ancestor as we go through some more options. If you are starting a separate ancestor practice for witch ancestors, like say maybe you don't have an ancestor practice currently, or if you have an ancestor practice but you want to keep your witch ancestor practice sort of separate from your regular ancestors, and there's reasons for that. So some people might think, well, my ancestors are pretty Protestant and they're not going to like having a bunch of witches around. I don't think that's necessarily a good reason, because if your concern is that your ancestors were Protestants, or you're concerned that your ancestors were Christian and they wouldn't like all these witches, then they probably wouldn't like you doing ancestor services to them either. But again, the dead aren't exactly the same once they're dead. So I think once they're in the afterlife, they see a broader range of things. They recognize that the world is a bit bigger and a bit more complex than what they may have thought it was in life. And so the idea that, oh, my ancestors were all Christians, they might not like being honored through ancestor work, or my ancestors were all Christians, they might not like me working with them for magic. Well, for one, Christianity is a death cult. Uh, Ancestor work is actually a big part of traditional Christianity. Um, but even if your particular recent ancestors were not part of those forms of Christianity, and if they were not part of Christianity in cultures where there was still a heavy folk magic presence in the Christianity that was around, the only way they're getting fed, the only way they're getting interacted with is through this ancestor work and through magical work. And so if they want that, they're going to be willing to engage with that. They're also going to see that in the rest of the world of the dead. They're going to see that these magical things exist, that these things that they may have not worked with or encountered in life exist, and their horizon should be somewhat broadened. And not everyone has that experience working with ancestors, but I also wonder how much of that is bias that people bring in, and they kind of force themselves to create those walls. Um, but my experience tends to be that their perspective is wider, and that a lot of their personal baggage is cleared out, because that's what dying does. That's part of dying. Um, so what I think would be more reasonable reasons to keep them apart is if you are looking at your kind of more traditional ancestor altar as a space for ancestor veneration and devotion and not a space for magical work, but that you want to work with your witch ancestors specifically for magic, either for learning magic or for doing magic, that's a good reason to keep them apart. Or if you think that there's certain magic that you might be more comfortable doing with your standard ancestors and then other magic that you would prefer to do with your witch ancestors, that might be a good reason to keep them apart. Or if you just want to kind of look at it as two different social groups, where some people don't like mixing their social groups. I could see that as being a reason, but I also feel like if you're doing that, then there's a question of how much you're welcoming the witch ancestors as actual ancestors. But let's say, regardless of your reason, you want to start a separate ancestor practice for the witch ancestors. You could go about it in what we might call the normal way. You set up an altar, call upon the deceased people that you're looking to connect with. So in this case, you pick the handful of witches that you want to connect with as witch ancestors, call upon their names, offer a candle, offer water, and you could leave it at just the offering, or you might talk with them a bit about what you're looking for in the relationship you're looking to develop. But you could start with just the offering, and then in like a second or third session, go through and try to talk with them about that. There's different ways people approach that when they're starting out. Some people just leave an offering initially. Some people try to engage as they leave the offering initially. Because these are not your blood ancestors, and dependent upon whether or not your approach to witchcraft is an approach that is modeled after or similar to historical witchcraft, then there may not be as strong of a link starting out there. So you might be aided by calling on guardians of the dead and asking them to help facilitate that connection. And so, which guardians of the dead that you call, that's kind of up to you. It can be the ones that you view as the more important guardians of the dead, or you can look at the time frame and the era that those witches were living in and think of who they would look to as guardians of the dead. So, if these were witches who were primarily Catholic, then they'd probably look at St. Peter. But if you are looking more from your own perspective, then look at who rules the afterlife in your own religious ideology and call upon them to bring them. There may also be spirits who take the dead back and forth that you might call upon to aid in bringing those ancestors, those witch ancestors here. You could sing lamentations to draw them up, but that's getting a little closer to kind of our witchy approach or witchy approaches. So that's our next option, is if instead of going that kind of normal low key route, you want to go a little more magical, a little bit more of a witchy way of doing it. Two options are to either engage in catabasis or engage in necromancy. So for your catabasis, you are journeying into the underworld. And so you would engage in whatever method of underworld journey is familiar to you. Go to the Keeper of the Dead and ask for access to the spirit you're seeking. And really, this is kind of important in general. And this is a sort of traditional idea that if you're going to try to access the dead, your right to access that spirit is based on permission from whoever keeps the dead. And so you should be prepared to ask their permission, and you should be prepared to give them offerings. Once you have that permission, while you're in the underworld, go to that spirit and ask them to form an alliance with you. Ask them if they will connect with you, join with you, work with you. While you're in the underworld, there's a lot of cool things that can help support this work. Depending upon what conception of the underworld you work with, those things will differ. But you might want to explore different elements of the underworld and different powers of the underworld and gain alliances with them or gain connections with them, because those will facilitate your ability to work with the dead. If you are not into the whole leaving your body and going into the world of the dead thing. Some people struggle with those things. You might prefer a necromantic approach in which you call upon and raise the dead, strengthening the dead to life with certain offerings. If you're going to take that approach, one way to do that would be to dig a trench. And your trench doesn't have to be a real trench, it doesn't have to be deep and trench like. You're not digging a ditch along the side of the road. Although, along the side of the road or at a crossroads would be a good place to do this. It can really just be you've etched a little stretch of ground that you can pour things into, where there's just enough of an indentation to pour in your offerings, and that's good enough. Call upon the guardians of the dead to release the particular spirits that you're calling upon. And a lot of times you're gonna, if you're establishing an initial relationship, you probably want to do this one spirit at a time. You may make an offering to the guardians of the dead separately at that point, or you may simply tell them that the offerings you're going to make to enliven the spirit, that they should take their portion of that offering as well. This will depend somewhat on your relationship with the guardians of the dead. Like, if you haven't worked with them a lot, you probably want to give them their own offering, and you probably want an offering that is the right one for the culture that they come from. If you've worked with them a lot and you've made offerings to have that access in the past, then giving them a portion of the offering that you're giving to the dead should be acceptable to them, and that should be fine. But you may have to negotiate that out with them. If the culture that you're working, the cultural perspective you're working from, has spirits that carry the dead back and forth, and a lot of cultures do, then you are probably going to want to call upon those spirits and also allow them to take a portion of the offering, because those are the spirits that are actually going to bring the dead to you, uh, because the guardians are just giving you access. They're saying you have permission to call this spirit forth from the land of the dead and allow them to exit the land of the dead temporarily. But they're not necessarily going to bring the spirit to you. They're going to expect you to either go to the spirit or have a spirit that can go and retrieve the spirit. So if you have a familiar, if you have other dead that you work with, you could have them go retrieve the spirit. But you're probably best off having whoever carries the dead do that, because they are a professional at that. It's what they do, it's their job. Um, they'll bring forth the spirit, and so again, you offer them a portion of the offering, or you might have a special offering for them. Some of that depends on who the being is, and again, some of it depends on your relationship with the being. Once the spirit of the dead has arrived, theoretically, the spirit is not going to be operable in the world. Now, a witch will already be straddling that line somewhat, and so they will be a little bit more operable in the world than just a regular dead person. And this is part of where we get into the difference between necromancy and ancestor work. There's a lot of people who kind of try to blur the line and treat any work with the dead as necromancy, but that's not accurate, and that's not like my opinion. That's just from an historical basis what the word necromancy means. Necromancy is a specialized sort of professional technique where you are raising the dead. The dead generally are in a state of confusion and weakness, where if you are at the right time or in the right sort of place, you can interact with them and they can kind of tell you about what they knew in life or what they've observed in that place, but they still usually need to be empowered in order to be able to speak. And if you want them to be able to act in the world, they need to be further empowered to act in the world. So there will almost always be some refreshing that needs to be done in order to interact with them. In an ancestor veneration sense, usually you are not pulling them into the world in the same way. And if you are facilitating that. You are using things like the candlelight to burn through the barrier between the world. You're using the water to refresh them and wake them up. You're using the offerings to fuel them in some way. But it's not quite the same as raising them, where they're fully empowered to act. And so in this case, you are going to go through this process of raising them in order to make this deal with them, and that will also empower them for a while. So your first couple interactions after that, they will be a little more powerful to interact with the world. And again, because they are witches, they will already be somewhat more powerful to interact with the world than a regular person would have been. So you call upon them. Once they're there, you give them their offerings. And so the offerings that I would use, coming out of a Greek necromancy perspective, are honey, wine, olive oil, milk, and flour. And if you really, really want them to have life in them and be empowered to fully and powerfully work in the world, then you would give them blood as well. If you're just calling them for this alliance, and if you're calling them to instrumentalize them towards some task that's relatively simple, you don't need blood. But if you are calling them for something a little more major, a little more intense, or if you need a more vital presence from them or a more powerful ability to act in the world, then giving them blood will do that. And once they're there, you want to create the terms of your alliance, ask them to function as an ancestor and be called upon your ancestor altar. Let them know what you will generally offer as regular offerings and how you would call them. And then get that agreement, and then you can begin to work with them on your ancestor altar. And again, you would probably do this one dead person at a time. You could, I guess, do a handful of them, but I think you'd be better off doing one at a time. And so if, say, you've got 4 or 5 witches that you want to set up on a witch ancestor altar as the named witches that you call, you're going to do this ritual for each one of them. And then once you have all of them there, then you'll just be able to name them on the altar when you're doing a regular ancestor service, just like you would with your standard ancestors. Now, either of these two methods, the catabasis or the necromantic method, it can be good to have some sort of physical anchor to use with them on your altar. And so you might have a special candle that is empowered as their candle that works as a vessel, and when the candle is lit, then that draws their presence and gives them the doorway to enter through. You might have a gifted item that is like a token or representation for them upon the altar that gives an anchor for them to connect to when they come through. Or, excuse me, you might have a spirit house or vessel that they can reside in or work through. And that last one sort of presumes a more ongoing presence, as opposed to more of your typical ancestor altar work where when the altar is open and when the altar is live, then the ancestors come through and work through it. If you're building a spirit house or a vessel to give them a physical anchor to work through, the expectation is that some part of them is residing there and that is always live. And there are good reasons to work that way sometimes, but that is a little bit more in-depth than a lot of people do for their ancestor work. And so we're not going to go super in-depth into how you would do that or what you would need to put in that sort of vessel, at least in this class. Now, once you have established that relationship, you've got to build an ongoing relationship. And so again, you're going to set up your altar. On your altar, you would likely have candles for each individual named ancestor. You might have a candle for the unnamed ancestors. There may be candles for the guardians of the dead or for any spirits that aid in bringing them back and forth. If this is a specialized ancestor altar, then you probably won't have candles for other groups of ancestors, whereas if this is part of your standard ancestor altar, you would have your named ancestors, both your familial ones, any other ones you have, and the witch ancestors. A candle for the unnamed witch ancestors, candle for unnamed family, probably a candle for unnamed other ancestors that connect with you via other affinities, as well as then candles for the additional spirits that you work with. Going back to creating the connection. If you are lucky enough to have some legendary witch figure, whether it's family legend or a local legend, uh, who is buried in your community, you could go and do the necromantic approach at their grave, which would be a very powerful way to connect with them. And then you might ask for dirt from their grave as a token to take back on your altar. That would also be useful in facilitating an alliance with that cemetery or graveyard in general. And so then you might look for dirt from the cemetery grounds outside of a grave for the connection with the guardians of that cemetery, and then potentially dirt from the oldest grave in the cemetery, as the spirit in charge of the spirits at that cemetery. Most people probably are not going to have a witch grave local to them, but if you do, that would be a great place to do that kind of work with that particular witch, if that's a particular witch you want to draw on. If you're in an area where there were trials, especially if the witches that you're connecting with were tried in that area, the grounds where the executions were done could be an option for a place to go if you don't have specific graves to go to. Or if you're in a place where they've been memorialized, then the grounds of the memorial may be a place to go to connect with them as well. So, depending on where you are, you might have some interesting options for places to go make those initial connections. Those could also be places to go and make special ongoing offerings aside from the work that you do at your ancestor altar. And so again, back to your ongoing relationship. So you've set up your ancestor altar, and then you would go through and do whatever your standard ancestor service practice is. I'm not going to go into how you set up one of those. I'm assuming most people listening to this have some sort of ancestor work that they do already. If you don't, my book, Living Spirits, A Guide to Magic in a World of Spirits, goes in depth into ancestor work. And my book, Luminarium, Guide to Cunning Conjuration, that or Grimoire of Cunning Conjuration, sorry, that has a version of the Ancestor Service that I use in it as well. And so there are lots of places where you can find examples of what an Ancestor Service would look like. You might modify it specifically if you are working with just the witch ancestors, but you don't have to. You can use the same standard one that you would use with any other ancestors as well. When you are calling upon the ancestors, you will have a litany of names for your named ancestors. Now, you can build a more prayer service like litany as a form of honor to them. So instead of just lighting their candles, saying their name, knocking on the altar, and going through each one with that, then you might have something where you say the name and then say a particular prayer line after the name. Or say the name and have some sort of epithet or description that you say after the name. And or both. And that can be a way that you more deeply engage with them, and that's something that you can carry outside of the ancestor service and use outside of the ancestor service as well. You might even do that as if, say, you do your ancestor service once a week or twice a month, or at the dark moon monthly, then that litany might be something that you do on a daily basis to connect at the altar, or when you come home, or as you leave your house and you're at your doorway. Your doorway can be a sacred space for working with liminal beings as well. You can use that litany that you've built as a way to connect with them outside of the formal ancestor service. You might also look at special days of observance. So if you have their birthday, or if you know the date of their death, or if they were an individual that went through a trial and you don't have the death date, if you have the date of the trial, some significant date on which you can specially honor that individual person, can be a way of building that ongoing relationship as well, where you give them a special offering, you specially name them in your service. Maybe you do a special religious rite to honor them or elevate them or soothe them on that day. That can be something that can be a really good way of building that relationship as well as empowering and elevating that spirit. Looking at historical witch days, and so like the Wheel of the Year, not really historical witch holidays, uh, but depending on the culture you're looking at, there are days that are associated with spirit flight for witches, days that are associated with the witches' Sabbath, um, and so depending on where you are, you might have Thursday nights or you might have Saturday nights, um, St. John's Eve, All Hallows Eve, Walpurgis Nacht, the Ember Days. There's a handful of days in various cultures that are associated with nights that witches are out and about. And so, any of those days that are specifically associated with witches and associated with spirit travel would be days that you could pick as special days of observance for your witch ancestors, aside from necessarily days that were particular to their own life. We can also work with the witch ancestors for ongoing magical work. It's not just ongoing relationship building or just a matter of honoring and venerating the dead. Now, working with ancestors can just be about ancestor veneration. It can just be about appreciating what these ancestors did and how that brought about the world that brought us about. And that is a part of religious devotion. That's something that can be a core part of pagan household religion. Um, and there doesn't have to be any magic involved in that. Most pagans were not doing magic. And even if you aren't pagan, if you just want that kind of personal household religion and household spirituality, then having that ancestor veneration and ancestor devotion can be an important part of that as well. In a Catholic context, honoring the dead, honoring your ancestors as part of your household devotional work would have also been common. Um, but if you are taking this from a magical perspective, which if we're calling on witch ancestors and connecting with them as witches, then it makes sense that magic would be part of that. Then let's talk a little bit about what we can do for magical work. And so that idea of a litany that we brought up, that can be a really easy step for incorporating the witch ancestors into magical work. Um, a lot of people have seen Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and it's been a few years for most people. So it may not be something that is immediately on the forefront of people's minds and memories. But in the episode where they uh, exercise Theo's uncle, Jesse Putnam, they do an exorcism that calls upon uh, various witches. And so they list a handful of witch names and then say, I believe, hear us sisters intercede on our behalf, or visit us sisters intercede on our behalf. And then they go through a handful more names and then say that again. And so those sorts of prayer litanies are a common element of religious and spiritual work, but also can be a common element of magical work. And so, in a conventional Catholic litany, you would have you go through the names of Mary, like in the Litany of Loreto, or you go through the names of the saints, and you would say the name and then pray for us. Um, you're not necessarily asking the witch ancestors to pray for you. They're not interceding with you for you on behalf of a god, but you're asking them to be present with you, or to work with you, or to lend their power to you or to your spell. And so, depending on what it is you want them to do, that can help structure your litany. So, if you are calling on Bessie Dunlop, Andrew Mann, Isabel Gowdy, and Thomas the Rhymer, then you might say, Bessie Dunlop, lend your power to this spell. Andrew Mann, lend your power to this spell. Isabel Gowdy, lend your power to this spell. Thomas the Rhymer, lend your power to this spell. And you'd probably have some beginning and some ending to that. And so, like, you might start with friends of the fairy queen and the devil, hear my call and come to my aid. Bessie Dunlop, lend your power to this spell. Andrew Mann, lend your power to this spell. Isabel Gowdy, lend your power to this spell. Thomas the Rhymer, lend your power to this spell. Come forth, sisters and brothers, witches who came before me, and aid me in this work in which we are about to engage together. And that can be your litany, or something along those lines. And that's one that I just kind of extemporaneously off the top of my head came up with. But you'll probably want one that you've written out beforehand and one that you've practiced and used routinely. Building up that litany, praying the litany regularly, working the litany into your ancestor service, and then having the instrumental form of the litany that's used in your magical work, you're going to draw that built up relationship into the work you're doing that way. All the kind of energy, all of the sharing back and forth, all of the power of the offerings and the connection with the dead that you've built up through those ancestor services. At that point, you're pulling that into the work you're doing, and that connection into the work you're doing when you're calling upon them to work with you, if it's essentially a version of the same litany. So the start and finish of the litany might not be the same between when you're doing it in your ancestor service versus when you're doing it in your magical work. But the actual core of the litany, the names that you're calling, and then what you say after the names, those will be the same or at least similar between the two. Or at least if you have the same sort of pattern and cadence between the two, that can create a link between them, even if the words are slightly different from when you're calling them for the service versus when you're calling them for work. You could also work with a specific witch for magic, and you don't have to necessarily call upon all the witches that you've called as witch ancestors. And so this might be something where you've developed your ongoing relationship with these witch ancestors, but maybe one of them stands out to you as one that you connect with a little bit more, one that's a little more similar to you, one that did things that kind of inspire you more than the other ones, or where their story is one that you feel something more from that story. And so you turn to that one. And so maybe you start doing some rituals where you share meals with that one in particular. You call upon them in rituals separate from the rest of them. Maybe they have additional special days to honor them. And they become kind of like your core focus as far as your witch ancestor. They become the main ancestor. And so they would be the one that you address on behalf of the rest of them if you're going to kind of call upon one to work with the whole group. But they can also be the one that you work with individually just on their own. And at that point, you're almost developing a relationship like with a familiar spirit, but there is not. It's not exactly the same relationship. There is sort of an implication with a familiar that there's a service element there. So even though you have things that you do to pay them for that service element, they still are serving you in some way. And even if it's a relatively equal relationship, there's still a bit of a power dynamic there. This is probably not going to be the same way. This is probably going to be more like they're like a tutelary spirit, where they're there to teach you and help you and guide you, but also assist you. And so, and those are things that a familiar will do. But again, the way that relationship works can look a little different. So you could call upon this individual witch as an intermediary. So say you're doing work with other spirits and you need a spirit to go get a spirit for you, or to go communicate something to a spirit for you, or to kind of guide the work that the other spirits you're calling on are doing. This witch spirit can do that. Calling upon a witch spirit adds another element, though, on this intermediary level. A lot of times when we talk about the familiar as an intermediary, or working with your ancestors as an intermediary, the idea is that they are able to function as intermediaries because they are in the spirit world, and so they can go and they can talk to a spirit for you. They can express things, they can guide things, they can ask a spirit to come. In the case of a witch, the witch has power, and so the witch can be an authoritative intermediary. So if you are trying to call a spirit and you don't want to call the spirit by virtue of particular god names, you don't want to conjure the spirit, but you still want some force that compels the spirit to come, and compels the spirit to work with you, but where the spirit's not necessarily bound by a divine name and you're not necessarily bound by the divine name, then you might use a witch intermediary, where the witch has magic, the witch has power, the witch can not just go to the spirit and ask the spirit to come, but the witch has some force behind them where they can kind of demand that that spirit come, and they can help enforce that that spirit behaves and interacts correctly. So they become sort of an alternate version of a source of authority for calling a spirit, where it's not really a conjuration, uh, but the spirit is kind of summoned and compelled somewhat. Um, you can also work with witch spirits as spirits to learn from, because they're witches and you're a witch and you need to learn to use witch power, and they have that and they know how to use it, but they also know how to use it from the perspective of being fully inspirited as the dead now. So they you can call upon them, necromantically empower them, work with them through divination, work with them through visions, and ask them to teach you things about magic, ask them to teach you spells, teach you magical techniques, teach you ways to work magic beyond those things that you might be learning in books. You can work with them in dream work and in spirit flight. And so some of that may be that when you want to learn from them, you do that by calling them and asking them to come speak to you in your dreams. Some of it may be that you engage in spirit flight, go to the spirit world and work with them directly, where you're working with them in a visionary experience that way, as opposed to calling them to you in a ritual magic setting and attempting to communicate with them there. But they can also facilitate those things for you. So if you're trying to work with a particular area of the dream world or do magic in the dream world, then you might call upon a witch ancestor to carry you to the place and help give you the lucidity that you need in order to work in the dream world, and for them to guide you in the spell work in the dream world. Or you might ask them to help you leave your body in spirit flight and help carry you on the spirit flight. That is a role that it's traditionally something the familiar spirit does. But there's no reason that a witch ancestor couldn't also do that role, that they know how to do that, and they are on the spirit side of it at this point. So they could help pull you forth and carry you to where it is that you're trying to go in the spirit world, to take you to the Sabbat, or take you to some place to interact with some particular spirit, or to learn some particular thing, or do some particular magic in the night. So there's lots of options, lots of things that we can do by working with these witch ancestors, both in a collective sense and in an individual sense. And it's not really a complicated process. It's something that, again, ancestor work tends to be a simple thing that people can start off with. It's an easy way to get into doing spirit work. And so doing spirit work with the witch ancestors can also be an easy way of getting started in doing spirit work. They might be a little bit more volatile, there might be a little bit more power going on there than when we're working with our regular ancestors, and so maybe you want to kind of start off with regular ancestor work and then start work with the witch ancestors. But it is still something where that can be a gateway to expanding your spiritual alliances and your spirit court, without necessarily going to spirits that are going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with, or spirits that might be a little bit more foreign to you, or that might involve more intense ritual procedures that you would have to engage with in order to start work with them. All right, so again, if you haven't listened to part one, I would definitely advise listening to part one, because that's going to give you a lot of the background for how to approach this and how to think about who witch ancestors are and how to identify them and how to learn about them. But now we've covered all the practical elements too. So hopefully that answers any questions that part one may have left for people who have already listened to part one. All right.